Hi everyone. All right. So back for a little more ethics. Uh, and today we are digging into Marx, right? So last videos were about Hannah Arendt's tradition of the modern age. We saw some basic Marxist thoughts sort of in discussion, Arendt's critiques and defenses of Marxism, um, which I liked as a little bit of a warm up to Marx. But let's jump right into Marx. So Karl Marx, a German philosopher and political economist. His dates are 1818 to 1883. Marx is most famous for a enormous tome of economics called Das Kapital, and Das Kapital is a critique of capitalism. It is the critique of capitalism that inspired the communists throughout the 20th century, the second half of the 19th, and throughout the 20th century, and is the primary inspiration for the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, on and on, communist and socialist revolutions and reforms throughout the 20th century, right? Marx has been vilified fairly absolutely in the United States, largely because of the United States' commitment to capitalism as the best possible political economic model or economic model. And in particular, vilified because of the Cold War, right? The war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So Marx remains a controversial figure, even within academia, even within philosophy. Perhaps one of the most, probably the most influential political philosopher of the last 200 years, and it's still, controversial on many, in many countries, and even on many college campuses to, be overly interested in Marx. I don't know, I haven't heard any stories about this sort of thing recently, but certainly when I was an undergrad, there were still stories circulating about professors who have been denied tenure for being Marxists, and there was the Marxist communist blacklists in Hollywood in the 50s, and anyway, this is not the point of any of this, but that's the Marx I'm talking about. And so what is Marx's critique of capital, Marx's critique of capitalism? That's what we're going to look at today. We're reading the Communist Manifesto. I haven't actually read the Communist Manifesto in quite a while. I've taught Marx recently, taught Marx in every ethics class, but haven't done the Communist Manifesto in a very long time. So it was good to reread and interesting. But let's start just with a little bit of the history, and this is stuff that Marx covers throughout the Communist Manifesto, the first and second sections in particular. But but I'd like to try and put it in more general terms, terms that we've been thinking about through the semester, more or less, beginning with the Enlightenment and the shift that philosophy and society and the world undergo with the scientific revolution and the beginning of the modern period, modernity, and in particular the democratic revolutions of the 18th century that were in many ways the apex of the modern philosophy with Descartes, but especially Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, the apex of the liberal philosophers of the early 18th century and 17th century, in particular John Locke and David Hume. In any case, right, the beginning of modernity and the Enlightenment period is really essentialized, I think, in the democratic revolutions, and for the sake of sticking more or less with Marx, let's think of the French Revolution of 1789, as our main example. And if we think of those democratic revolutions as the culmination of many of the forces of modernity, including the Reformation, the Age of Discovery, colonialism, scientific revolution, and innumerable other forces. But if we see those revolutions as the sort of apex of a discrete historical movement, as we were talking about in the last videos, what Arendt would call a tradition, and we might think of it as the tradition of liberalism, right, and republicanism. So if that's the apex, then immediately after those revolutions, we will begin to see a kind of decline. And this is the beginning of the tradition, to continue that Arendtian language, undoing itself, unraveling, coming to its close. And Marx is going to have an interpretation of the aftermath of those revolutions that is going to account for that decline in a very different way than many other thinkers or historians will. And so the way I'm describing this aftermath from the revolutions, the French Revolution in particular, is again drawing a lot from Hannah Arendt and that book I mentioned in the last lecture on totalitarianism. But essentially, what Marx is concerned about, we mentioned last time his historical materialism, finding material causes for the current state of society. But also thinking about last lecture, and the idea that Marx thinks political philosophy needs to proceed from a analysis of the real circumstances of the time. Marx is analyzing the state of capitalism as it is in mid-19th century Germany. And though his analysis of history is sweeping, going all the way back to the beginnings of human civilization, however we imagine those, the more immediate material circumstances that lead to the conditions that he's interested in analyzing in mid-19th century Germany begin with those democratic revolutions. And he wants to think about how those revolutions, with such high ideals, can lead to the kind of exploitation and misery that he's witnessing during his time. And so I think it's worth prefacing this by saying, as we mentioned in the last video, there are many who act as though Marx doesn't belong to the Western philosophical tradition, that he somehow is outside of it or shouldn't count for some reason. But my understanding of Marx is that in many ways, Marx is a continuation of Enlightenment thinking, a continuation of the sort of spirit of those democratic and democratic, but also to some extent Republican revolutions. The very young Marx, refers to communism as radical democracy. And when we think about the universalism that Marx believes in, communism, the universalism of communism, I don't know why we wouldn't draw a comparison to the kind of universalism we find in Kant. Kant's universalism is based in pure reason and idealism, whereas Marx's universalism pertains to material circumstances. But that idea of universalism and the hope of achieving a universal, which, as for Kant, also for Marx, meant a global, planetary, universal form of government, of organization. So Marx, in many ways, continues the Enlightenment project, and that would be really upsetting for many Marxists to hear, and also for many liberals, classical liberals.